The film opens with 3 wise men arriving in Bethlehem to meet the future king of the Jews. They disturb the chosen one's mother before showering Mandy with presents for her newborn. Expecting more from their coming Messiah, the mannish mother moves the 3 along, but they promptly return to retrieve their gifts. They realize their mistake and that the Son of God's actually just been born at a manger down the street, leaving the baby to be blamed. Over the next 33 years, Brian grows up to resent the Roman occupation of his beloved Judea, and works at the local Colosseum selling imperialistic tidbits like wren's livers and jaguar's earlobe. One Saturday afternoon at about tea time, the true Messiah is giving his sermon about the meek inheriting the earth. Brian and Mandy are situated at the back of a large crowd who are all unable to hear clearly what the man says. The quote of "Blessed are the cheesemakers" is misconstrued by Mr. Gregory as meaning all manufacturers of dairy products. In the group's frustration to hear the speech, 2 men begin arguing, with one calling the other Big Nose. After many threats of thumps, Big Nose eventually swings but accidentally hits Mrs. Gregory and a brawl commences. Growing bored of Jesus's claims, Mandy decides to take her son to the nearby stoning of a local boy. On the way out, Brian gets his first glimpse of the rebel group called the People's Front of Judea, a faction of Jews who, like Brian, hate the Romans, but they just mostly sit around discussing what they wish would happen. Outside of the execution, Mandy and Brian meet a craftsman selling the highest quality stones. They buy some pointy ones, 2 flats and a packet of gravel, as Mandy along with many others are forced to wear fake beards as women aren't allowed to attend a stoning. While the high priest is reading off the crimes, he gets suspicious that women may be attending the event as the deep-voiced crowd struggle to maintain their base. Matthias is charged with blasphemy as he said the name Jehovah, which I don't think has ever been a crime in history to do. He continues to say the name, getting a rock preemptively thrown at him by a bearded lady, who's now told to go to the back of the line. When the priest recites the crime, he has a stone thrown at him for saying the exact same name of Jehovah. That person's in turn stoned for saying Jehovah, and the whole crowd focus the priest before finishing him off with a rather large one. Upon returning to the big city, Mandy and Brian are targeted by an ex-leper begging for money. The light-footed man heckles Brian for how much he's willing to donate, so Mandy tells him to piss off. He returns and explains that the bloody do-gooder Jesus cured his leprosy, making life as a beggar much harder as he garners less sympathy. The ex-leper complains when he only receives half a denarii and gets told that you just can't help some people, which he says is the same thing that Jesus said about him after the miracle. As the ex-leper gracefully glides by a turret, Mandy and Brian get home to a Roman officer waiting in their living room. Brian learns from his mother that he in fact isn't Jewish at all, and that his father was a Roman centurion named Nautius Maximus who forced himself upon Mandy, if you can believe that. She tells of the time the Roman had his way with her as if it's a love story for the ages. With a hate of Romans too strong to believe it, and with Mandy about to start work, Brian goes to work himself, where today he's selling Wolf's nipple chips, Camel pretzels and Tuscany fried bats. During a mild show intended for children, in which the slave tossed into the pit just decides to do the running man strategy, Brian spots the rebel faction from earlier and approaches them. They're currently discussing Stan's desire to become a woman and his right to have a baby despite having nowhere to gestate it. With a growing attraction for the female rebel Judith, Brian asks to join the PFJ in their fight against oppression from the Romans. The group's leader Reg lets him join when he hears how much Brian hates the Romans, and begins talking crap about all the other separatist movements with similar names. Like the Judean People's Front, the Popular People's Front, and the Popular Front, who's just a single man that was once much more popular. The names are so confusing that the now named Loretta insults the People's Front of Judea, forgetting that it's their own name. Meanwhile, as Reg snacks on some sea otter's nose, the exhausted gladiator drops dead of a heart attack, leaving the slave your champion. That night the group give Brian his first assignment as a rebel. He attempts to graffiti on the wall of the governor's palace but is busted by a passing centurion. The Latin's meant to translate into Romans go home, but deadly Dirk brings Brian up on his faulty grammar and forces him to write the correct spelling 100 times over, whereby morning the palace exteriors completely covered in paint. When the Romans change shifts, the new guards immediately try to arrest Brian for vandalism. The People's Front of Judea complain that despite the aqueducts, sanitation, medicine, education, wine, public order, irrigation and the roads, what have the Romans ever really done for them? Brian manages to elude the guards and is found by Judith, who brings him back to the PFJ's safe house. Reg seems to be the most cowardice of the bunch and goes over his plan to kidnap the governor's wife. The new guy assists a small group of insurgents in breaking into the palace by way of the sewer system and a mosaic's leafy parts. They intend to hold the wife for ransom, but they're discovered in the act by another group of rebels campaigning for a free Galilee. Both have the same intentions, so they begin to battle amongst themselves silently for the right to the wife. The whole time Brian's trying to break them up until the last two eventually kill each other, leaving Brian alone to be found by the guards. They throw him in the dungeon, where he meets a convict named Ben. Despite being chained to a wall, he adores the Romans and says how lucky Brian is to have them spit in his face. He says that for a first-time offender Brian's likely to get away with only being crucified, and he himself has been hanging there for 5 years, though he says it's very fair for the crimes he's committed. Brian's retrieved by the guards and taken to the governor of Judea, Pontius Pilate. He suffers from rhoticism, where he mispronounces the R's and calls Brian Brian. He claims to be of Roman descent and mentions his father's name Nautius Maximus, but Dirk laughs it off and says that it's a joke name like Silius Sodus or Biggus Dicus. But Pontius has a good friend in Rome called Biggus and finds nothing amusing about it at all. The guards begin to either break down laughing at the names getting themselves thrown out of the palace, or manage to hold it in with what looks like the might of Jupiter himself. All the while Dirk slapping Brian upside the head every time he corrects Pontius's pronunciations. And when the governor finally tells of Biggus's wife named Incontinentia buttocks, the whole room cracks up in hysterics, allowing Brian to slip away. He's pursued up an unfinished tower and straight off the end of the staircase, landing himself in an alien spacecraft. The two cycloptic extraterrestrials take him into space, where they engage in a galactic dogfight. They eventually run into an asteroid before being shot out of space, sending all three crashing back down to Earth. Brian survives the crash and goes straight back to being chased around by the Romans. He flees into a marketplace where he tries to buy a disguise from Harry the Haggler. Offering the full price, the merchant refuses to sell it and instead talks crap about his own product in an attempt to get Brian to lower his offer. In a rush, Brian haggles him down to a price which consists of a free gourd, but when telling Harry to keep the change, it sets him off in another tangent about bartering, so Brian just legs it. At PFJ headquarters, the surviving members are mourning their team's loss, assuming Brian to be among the dead. They all take up cleverly thought out hiding spots when they hear someone entering, but it's just Brian in disguise. Suddenly Dirk shows up with his Praetorian guards and they search the house while the caretaker pretends to be a feeble old man. He claims that there are much worse punishments than crucifixions, as at least you get some fresh air in the process. The guards find nothing but a suspicious wooden spoon and depart empty-handed. Brian's hiding on the balcony above an alley in which a motley group of mystics and prophets preach to the passing crowd. The blood and thunder prophet screams of a three-headed serpent rubbing its parts. The false prophet claims that a demon's coming for the sinners, and a downright boring one that tells of a time of confusion when we will lose simple things like our father's hammer. Somehow he manages to go from one listener to half a dozen, when the balcony collapses and Brian unwittingly takes his place on the podium. Forced to come up with something plausible in order to blend in, Brian starts talking about birds leading simple lives and that we should do the same, but the crowd assumes he's having a go at the birds for being lazy. Once the Romans leave, Brian cuts his sentence short, leaving the crowd to assume that he must know something. They push a poor blind man out of the way to hear, but Brian just gives the gourd away and silently leaves. Brian's unintentionally created a following of people who begin to chase him around, desperate for answers. A sandal slips off his foot, which gets picked up by a follower and becomes a second artifact in the religion of Brian, as two separate religious denominations begin to form around the objects. Another man attempts to make a third, but nobody listens to him as he has no holy relic to worship. The crowd chase their new messiah into the hills, where he finds an old man living in a hole and jumps on his foot, ending the man's 18-year vow of silence when he lets out a scream. He then begins gleefully shouting aloud, attracting the attention of the growing crowd. Everything has them believing Brian's the coming messiah. They're starving, so Brian tells them to eat berries from a nearby bush, which they assume he just conjured. They think the hairy naked man was mute and that Brian cured him. The blind man claims to have vision after being touched by him, but walks straight into the ditch. But the greatest piece of evidence for them is Brian's denial of even being the chosen one. So he says that he really is the Messiah, which confirms it to all of them, showing that he had no hope in getting rid of them whichever way he went with it. The old man gets pissed off at the crowd's new Messiah, so they all carry him away for execution. After spending the night with Judith, Brian wakes in the morning to discover first that the much larger crowd's waiting outside of his mother's house. Mandy enters and is sure that Brian's done something wrong to cause all of this. She's shocked to meet a full-frontal Judith who protects her abused Messiah while his mother tells the people to move along. They begin to worship her as the mother of the chosen one. So Mandy lets Brian have one last word in which he's helpless to change their minds, as everything he says is immediately taken as the word of God. Mandy cuts things short where a shrubber asks if the mother of their chosen one's a virgin. With her shrill voice telling them to bugger off, the crowd's convinced that no one would sleep with Mandy and that therefore Brian must be born of immaculate conception. He gets a PFJ escort through the crowd of people who once asked Jesus for a handout and now ask Brian, including the lead guitarist from the Beatles, George Harrison. With all the attention, Brian goes outside with Judith and is finally captured by Dirk. He's taken back to the governor's palace, where Pilate's friend Biggus has come to attend the proceedings. He also speaks with a lisp and offers to speak in front of the whole city alongside the governor. As a show of humility, Pontius offers to release a prisoner, but the townspeople give him fake names like Wodwick and Wadger to highlight his strong speech impediment. Biggus takes over and with his lisp recites prisoner names like Samson the Sadducee Strangler and Silas the Assyrian Assassin. Meanwhile, Brian's put through processing where the cheeky man from earlier is being crucified alongside him. The party's given their crosses and ordered to march them through the streets of Jerusalem while the inmate shouts at how lucky they all are. One good Samaritan offers to bear a convict's load, but he takes off, leaving the innocent man to be executed in his place. The PFJ refuse to help Judith in rescuing Brian and instead just spend their time making plans. By the time Judith gets to the palace, the crowd's laughing hysterically and shout alongside her to release Brian. But she's too late as the convicts are already being crucified, with Big Nose complaining that he's been put in the Jewish section with the Gregories when he's actually a Samaritan. The people's front of Judea finally do something and march in full force down to the crucifixion. Reg has written out a speech thanking Brian for his martyrdom so that the PFJ may continue doing nothing of any use. They begin singing "For He's a Jolly Good Fellow" when Dirk and his men are sent by Pontius to release Brian. In a parody of Spartacus, the various people all claim to be Brian of Nazareth, as the real Brian goes unheard from all the shouting. Mr. Cheeky's released and tells them that he's only joking about being Brian, but they don't believe him, when the Judean People's Front come charging over the hill with the intent of action. Instead of freeing anyone, the aptly named Suicide Squad take out their swords and stab themselves through their little chestplate hatches in protest. Next, Judith gets there, giving Brian some hope, but she's spoken to Reg and supports his idea to let Brian die a martyr. Mandy's less than enthused with her son and yells at him as if he's doing it on purpose. Left abandoned in the hot sun by anyone who might help him, one of his fellow sufferers begins singing to always look on the bright side of life. Brian alongside the others all begin to join in. And the movie ends.
He's not the Messiah, he's a very naughty boy!
So you made it. I appreciate your time. I couldn't have done it without you. Tell your mother I said thanks.